the 19th of November 1941, off Western Australia. A modern light cruiser met a cargo ship that wasn't an encounter where recognition, protocol, range, and deception decided the exchange rate between a raider and a fleet unit. November 1941, Indian Ocean Sea Lanes and Deception Doctrine. By early November 1941, the Indian Ocean traffic off Western Australia carried bauxite, wool, wheat, and machinery along coastwise routes to Fremantle and beyond. The Royal Australian Navy's flagship light cruiser HMAS Sydney, modified Leander class, 4 twin 152mm turrets, nominal top speed to 32 knots, and a full load displacement near 9,100 tons had completed convoy and troopship escort tasks amounting to thousands of nautical miles since 1939. She was battle-tested. At Cape Spada in July 1940, she helped sink the Italian cruiser Bartolomeo Colleoni, an action often summarized in fleet records by gunnery figures and maneuvering tracks rather than rhetoric. Against commerce raiders, however, the fight was not one of symmetric silhouettes, but of paperwork, signals, and the timing of gun shutters. German auxiliary cruisers Hilfskreuzer were armed merchantmen built for misidentification. HSK Kormoran, Schiff 41, later often cited as HSK-8, carried 6 150mm guns behind falsework light AA torpedo tubes, uncertain, exact mount configuration in wartime fit, generally cited as multiple 533mm tubes, and a mine inventory on the order of several hundred, often reported to 320. Her cruising speed hovered around 14-17 knots, with a nominal maximum near 18 knots when clean, trading sustained range, well over 10,000 nmi, on diesel fuel at economy speeds, for tactical agility far below that of a purpose-built cruiser. The disguise program included paint schemes, false deck cargo, dummy cranes, and interchangeable name boards. In November, she sailed as the Dutch Straat Malacca, a cover identity with plausible routing. The operational geometry off Western Australia favored ambiguity. Coastal shipping lanes bent around Shark Bay and Geraldton. Air patrols existed but were thin in coverage and limited by endurance. Typical patrol aircraft of the period flew to 140 knots. True, with tilde, 8 hours endurance, leaving large temporal gaps. Naval challenge procedures. Permanent service instructions required the warship to elicit identity via flags and lamp, confirm call signs, and, if doubt persisted, to close for visual details, such as house flags or registry marks. Doctrine emphasized positive identification before opening fire. It did not assume that every solitary freighter was a raider, nor did it discount the risk. Kormoran's captain, Frigatenkapitein Theodor Detmers, later summarized the raider's method: wait, pose, and if pressed to the point of compromise, drop the screens and fire first. Paraphrase from Detmers' post-war memoir divided by statement 1943-47. In the same era, an Australian administrative directive stressed the parallel imperative: approach with caution, insist on correct replies to challenges before accepting identity. Paraphrase from RAN Signal and Challenge Instructions, 1941. In practice, those two sentences outlined a narrow corridor. A raider survived by keeping the enemy uncertain at ranges where a cruiser could not yet read the telltale inconsistencies. A cruiser preserved advantage by maintaining standoff distance 5,000, 8,000 yards or more, while testing identity under the shadow of superior fire control. Sydney's specifications embodied that standoff logic. Her 152mm guns reached beyond 20,000 yards. Even at 10,000 yards, ladder salvos and director control could rapidly straddle a large merchant hull. She carried torpedo armament of her own and a Walrus spotter aircraft capable of to 110 knots, useful for wide-area reconnaissance in clear weather. The advantage was quantitative: superior speed by to 14 knots, gun range exceeding a raider's by several thousand yards, and fire control aided by stable platforms and trained crews. Yet all of that superiority depended on range and warning time variables that doctrine could protect only if the approach was conservative. German raiders, for their part, exploited the merchant marine's diversity. A false identity could be supported by a plausible route plan, altered funnel heights, and shifted deck cargo to mimic known silhouettes. A simple mishoist or delayed lamp reply could be attributed to language barriers, damaged gear, or nervous civilians. Each minute a cruiser spent resolving such ambiguities at closing speed reduced engagement time at safe range by a calculable amount. A relative approach at 20 knots closes 1,000 yards in roughly 1.5 minutes. At 25 knots, into 1.2 minutes. In the narrow coastal light of afternoon, those minutes compressed decision space. The historiography of the Sydney Kormoran encounter turns on these mechanics. At what range did the cruiser finally stop giving the raider the benefit of the doubt? Who fired first? And how did a torpedo launched from a platform with far lower tactical speed find a target renowned for maneuverability? Contemporary German statements emphasize the raider's last-second unmasking and rapid fire. Later, Australian inquiries have parsed signals, logs, gunnery estimates, and wreck damage patterns. As one post-war commission member put it, doctrine met deception at short range, and in that meeting the physics of ordnance and closure left no slack. Paraphrase, commission commentary, Lansenling's O. For the viewer, the analytical frame is straightforward. On one side stood a fleet cruiser with an 8-gun broadside to 6 rounds per minute per gun under ideal conditions, and armored protection measured in inches, roughly 3 inches on turret faces and belt sections in the Leander lineage. On the other, a camouflaged freighter hiding 150mm rifles and torpedoes, its best hope inside 3,000 yards where shell flight time drops below 4-5 seconds and a single torpedo running tilde, 40 knots can cover 1,000 yards in under a minute. November 1941, placed these two designs on intersecting tracks off Western Australia. The rest of this documentary will proceed from the geometry of that meeting toward the material outcomes on both hulls. The strategic asymmetry in November 1941 was not in tonnage or speed, but in approach geometry. If a cruiser's identification drill compressed the range too far, the raider's only viable tactic, sudden disclosure and first salvo with torpedoes, could neutralize the cruiser's quantitative advantages. The 19th of November 1941, off Western Australia tracks converge and signals begin. At midday on 19 November 1941, the trade wind set a low sea and long swell west of Shark Bay. HSK Kormoran logged on an economy run of roughly 10-12 knots to conserve fuel reserves for a next-leg mining operation, reported mine stock to 300 plus, altered course intermittently to mimic a merchantman's weather helm. Her disguise remained the Dutch freighter Strat Malacca, with deck cargo dummies and altered superstructure lines intended to pass a quick lens inspection at 5,000, 8,000 yards. HMAS Sydney, homeward bound to Fremantle after a northern escort commitment. Uncertain, the specific ship handover often cited as the troopship Zealandia at or near Sunda Strait. Steamed south-southeast at a speed consistent with a cruiser returning independently, plausibly 18-20 knots, well below her to 32-knot maximum but above a raider's comfortable cruise. Initial visual contact occurred in mid-afternoon at a separation band later reconstructed in the tens of thousands of yards. Standard procedure placed identification by signal lamp and flags at priority. The cruiser's signal team demanded call signs and routing particulars. In post-war recollection, Kormoran's captain, Theodore Detmers, described a deliberate delay. "We kept to the story and bought time," Detmers, post-war notes, paraphrase. Each minute consumed at an average relative closure of to 20 knots reduced the spacing by to 670 yards. At 12 minutes, A ship at 8,000 yards would find itself near 0.7 nautical miles if both held converging headings. The geometry mattered more than the theater of false ensigns. A freighter silhouette that absorbed time also absorbed distance. Sydney's aircraft, an embarked supermarine Walrus, capable of roughly 110 knots and 4-5 hours endurance, was not launched before the gunnery exchange. Whether the decision owed to sea state, daylight remaining, sunset near 1850 local, or confidence in visual identification remains a point of analysis. An airborne spotter would have extended visual baseline by tens of miles and provided cross-checks on flags and hull markings. The absence of a launch compressed the cruiser's sensor picture to bridge optics and rangefinders, which, though capable, do not erase the advantages of distance and elevation. Signal traffic then narrowed to call signs. Kormoran is reported to have offered a set consistent with a Dutch registry but mismatched in details under closer questioning. Historiography. Some accounts stress an incorrect last letter, others delays and partial hoists. A merchantman uncertain under pressure, however, was not evidence per se of a raider. Australian instructions emphasized verification, not presumption. One contemporary formulation read, "Until identity is established beyond doubt, ships are to proceed with caution and insist upon correct replies to challenges," ran instructions, 1941, paraphrase. The phrase, "proceed with caution," did not mandate a specific yardage. That gap between doctrine and numeric practice became the battlefield. By multiple German survivor accounts, Sydney took position on Kormoran's beam to port, roughly parallel, with estimates of opening range often cited within 1,000–2,000 yards. At 1,500 yards, 152 millimeters shell time of flight is on the order of 3–4 seconds. At 1,000 yards, closer to 2–3 seconds intervals, in which a trained gun crew can achieve first-salvo hits on a large, unarmored hull if the sights are settled. Conversely, a cruiser at those ranges exposes topside control positions and the bridge to medium-caliber shell fire capable of disabling directors and communications in a handful of impacts. The torpedo problem emerges from the same arithmetic. A 533 mm torpedo at to 40 knots covers 1,000 yards in under a minute. Even at to 30 knots, the run is tilde. 1 minute 5 seconds short enough that evasive action requires instant recognition of the launch. Detmer's account places the unmasking removal of concealment screens, battle ensign hoist, and first salvo at the cusp of being compelled to identify decisively. Once our position would be compromised, we had to fight at once. Detmer's paraphrase. Kormoran's 150 mm guns, initially masked, were sighted for broadside fire. Her torpedo mounts to starboard aligned with the Australian cruiser's bearing. Whether Sydney had already trained turrets and prepared to fire remains debated. Some reconstructions assert that A and B turrets were not yet delivering full-rate fire at the instant of the torpedo launch. What is less debated is the effect of first strikes on command and control. Even 1 or 2 150 mm shells detonating near the bridge and director could degrade ranging, voice, pipe continuity, and fire control solutions within seconds. A later Australian commission summarized the sequence in analytical terms. Short-range identification left the cruiser vulnerable to a combined torpedo and gunnery opening, with immediate impact on fighting efficiency. Commission commentary. 2009. Paraphrase. Fuel, light, and coastline also shaped decisions. With Australia's coast to the east and south, the raiders' best escape from a superior enemy, if not sunk outright, was to delay, disable, and then scuttle to avoid capture of codebooks and machinery. For the cruiser, the optimal engagement remained a standoff gunnery action at 5,000, 8,000 yards, where director control, armor, and volume of fire yield favorable exchange rates. The gap between the optimum, thousands of yards, and the actual, close quarters, is measurable and operationally decisive. Two quantitative frames clarify the pivot. First, closure rate at a combined 20 knots. The distance shrinks by to 2 cables per minute. A 5-minute exchange of signals at converging headings can erase a kilometer of safety margin. Second, survivability Leander-class armor was designed to resist splinters and medium caliber at range. At 1,000–2,000 yards, 150 millimeters AP divided by HE shells need little ballistic advantage to damage unarmored superstructure. In that regime, one well-placed torpedo compromises buoyancy and speed, while gunfire strips eyes and ears. The minutes consumed by identification at converging headings converted protocol into proximity. At to 1,000–2,000 yards, the Raiders' opening package 150 millimeters broadsides plus a short torpedo run neutralized the cruiser's standoff advantages before they could be applied. Late afternoon, the 19th of November 1941, off Western Australia unmasking, torpedo, and first-salvo effects. When Kormoran finally dropped her concealment, hoisted the battle ensign, and unshuttered gun ports, the geometry of the fight was already inside short-range parameters. Estimates frequently place the moment at roughly 1,000–2,000 yards on near-parallel courses port to port. At those distances, a 150 millimeter shell with a muzzle velocity on the order of 850 meters per second traverses 1,500 yards in roughly 3 seconds, while a German G7, a steam torpedo commonly capable of 44 knots on a short setting, uncertain, exact setting used, would need under 50 seconds to cover 1,000 yards. The arithmetic favored the ship that fired first and struck command spaces. German accounts and subsequent technical analysis converge on a rapid opening by Kormoran's 6 150 mm guns and a near-immediate torpedo launch to starboard. The first gunnery impacts are widely described as concentrating on Sydney's bridge, director control tower, and forward turrets. "We aimed at the bridge and the forward mounts," Detmers later recalled of his fire orders, paraphrase, post-war notes. The practical effect of even 2 or 3 early hits in those areas is disproportionate. Destroy range-finding optics, cut voice pipes and telephone runs, jam training gears with splinters, and force local control on surviving mounts. Under director control, a Leander-class cruiser could coordinate 8 6-inch rifles at to 5–7 rounds per minute per gun. Under local control after a shock to the bridge and director, rate and accuracy often fall precipitously in the first minutes. Wreck evidence recovered in the 2008–2011 investigations supports a forward port torpedo impact on Sydney, close to or under A divided by B turret positions. Historiography. Precise frame count and exact inboard location vary across technical reports. A hit in that region would flood forward compartments and voids, deform bow structure, and crucially reduce speed and trim while disrupting internal communications. Flooding rates depend on compartmentation and damage control response. Even a partial breach near the fore magazines imposes an immediate burden measured in tons per minute. If Sydney had been making to 18–20 knots before the strike, a drop of even 5–8 knots in the first few minutes would lengthen her tactical problem. Time to turn away, bring undamaged mounts to bear, and restore any form of centralized control. Kormoran's own gunnery was not without cost. Firing heavy broadsides at such short range exposes an unarmored raider to return 6-inch shells capable of smashing through superstructure and igniting deck cargo. German survivor testimony acknowledges damage and fire spreading quickly on Kormoran's upper works, paraphrase. But in the earliest phase, the effect on Sydney's topside command spaces appears decisive. A paraphrased line from an Australian inquiry summary captures the sequence. Loss of director and bridge functions within the first minute compromised coordinated fire. Subsequent hits reinforced that loss. HMAS Sydney II Commission of Inquiry, 2009. Paraphrase. The Walrus aircraft, stowed near the after superstructure, is reported to have caught fire or been rendered unusable early in the action, a predictable outcome, given the vulnerability of aircraft fuel and structure to splinters and blast. Removing the possibility of a subsequent launch eliminated a potential spotting and reconnaissance asset that might have helped re-establish situational awareness if the ships separated. The effect is again measurable. An aircraft at to 110 knots could have widened the observation baseline by 5-10 nautical miles in minutes. Without it, Sydney's view narrowed to whatever could be seen from surviving platforms. Damage control doctrine aboard Commonwealth cruisers relied on rapid boundary setting, counter-flooding, and flexible communications, often sound-powered phones and runners when electrical systems failed. At short range under fire, those measures collide with a second-by-second attrition of topside stations. If we assume a conservative 2-3 penetrations per minute by 150 mm shells in the first, exchange a rate consistent with 6 guns at tilde, 5 revolutions per minute, scoring even a modest 10–15% hit fraction at close range. Then in 3 minutes, Sydney might suffer half a dozen critical topside hits, each capable of disabling a function. Meanwhile, the torpedo's hydrodynamic effects shock, water ingress, list make fine gunnery corrections difficult even for undamaged turrets. Whether Sydney returned effective fire in the opening minute is debated. Some reconstructions credit at least intermittent salvos from aft turrets that scored on Kormoran's superstructure and lifeboat areas. Others argue that early damage to directors delayed accurate response. "We were hit soon after and fires started," a Kormoran officer later noted, paraphrase. Either way, the exchange ratio in the first phase favored the raiders' plan: disable the cruiser's eyes, slow her, and keep her within torpedo and medium-caliber lethality. By the time the first 3 to 5 minutes elapsed, the battle's profile had shifted. Instead of a standoff gunnery duel at 5,000–8,000 yards leveraging Sydney's armor, speed, and fire control, the fight became a close-range attrition, where exposure time multiplied damage. If Sydney attempted to turn away to open the range, the combination of forward flooding and impaired helm divided by order circuits would slow the maneuver. If she held course, she remained inside a lethal envelope, defined not by armor thickness, but by the density of hits to unarmored superstructure. In either case, a single torpedo hit at the bow redefined survivability calculations for a ship designed with limited torpedo defense in that zone. One further caution is warranted on the question of catastrophic magazine events. Some wartime rumors and later narratives posited a sudden, decisive explosion aboard Sydney. The wreck studies have tended to support progressive damage with extensive topside destruction and forward structural failure, rather than a single magazine blast as the sole cause. Historiography. View A favors catastrophic event. View B favors cumulative effects and progressive flooding. The operational import is the same. Once director control and speed were degraded, the cruiser's ability to reassert standoff fighting qualities approached zero. First-salvo effects at 1,000–2,000 yards bridge, divided by director suppression plus a forward port torpedo, converted Sydney's superior gunnery potential into a local control, speed-reduced fight. In that compressed regime, cumulative topside damage and flooding erased the cruiser's standoff advantages within minutes. Late afternoon to dusk, the 19th of November 1941, off Western Australia, close quarters attrition and attempts to break contact, with director and bridge control degraded and a forward port torpedo impact altering trim, HMAS Sydney's next choices were governed by geometry and damage control. At ranges still estimated within to 1,000–3,000 yards, even small helm delays translated into exposure. A 10 degrees course change at 18 knots takes tilde 35–40 seconds to complete through 100, 100, and 50 meters of lateral movement, enough time for an opposing battery of 6 150mm rifles to deliver another 10-15 shells. German recollections placed the ships initially on roughly parallel courses, port to port, before Sydney began to shear to open the distance and unmask aft turrets more consistently. The loss of speed, plausibly from to 18-20 knots down toward the low teens, lengthened every maneuver, turning what might have been a 1-2 minute widening into a multi-minute arc under fire. Kormoran kept firing. Detmers later noted that his gunners aimed for bridge, 4 turrets, and fire control positions first, then for secondary armament and aircraft. Paraphrase, post-war notes. The effect of concentrated topside hits accumulates quickly. Splinter showers cut signal halyards and voice runs. Open mounts suffer crew casualties, and fire hoses and hydrants lose pressure if lines are severed. In an attrition calculus, 2 metrics dominated the moment rate of effective hits per minute and the ship's remaining ability to coordinate boundary cooling and counterflooding. If the raider achieved even a 10% hit fraction at 1,500 yards with 6 guns at to 5 revolutions per minute, that is 3-4 significant hits per minute against an unarmored superstructure. Sydney's return fire, by German accounts, and later inferences from Kormoran's damage patterns, was not absent. Several shells are described as striking the raider's upper works and boats, and fires were observed spreading aft. Kormoran's topside carried mine-handling gear and dummies, and below decks she reportedly held on the order of to 300+ mines, uncertain exact count on 19 November. Flames near fuel lines and ammunition lockers forced German damage parties to split between firefighting, ammunition supply, and maintaining propulsion. Detmers summarized the logic of endurance at close range. Our survival depended on keeping her blind and slow. Every minute increased our own risk. Paraphrase. The raider's best-case outcome, disable, escape, and later scuttle to avoid capture, required that her engines keep rhythm and that deck fires not reach sensitive stores. As the engagement carried toward late afternoon, light began to change. Sunset near to 1850 local time meant decreasing contrast for rangefinders, a factor that can reduce hit probability by measurable fractions per minute under smoke. Both ships produced smoke Sydney from damage and Kormoran from deliberate smoke-making and fires aft. Smoke affects director optics more than local sights, but with Sydney's centralized systems degraded, the difference narrowed. A practical metric here is sightline. At 2,000 yards behind drifting smoke, effective target silhouette can shrink by 20–40%, depending on wind, trade wind, to 10–15 knots. That reduction benefits the unit trying to open the range, but it also complicates damage control coordination when visual checkpoints between parties are lost. Fuel, heat, and the mine load forced decisions aboard Kormoran. German testimony describes orders to prepare scuttling charges if fires threatened the engine room or mine decks. Paraphrase. Even before the final separation, engineering reports indicated overheating risks. If seawater systems are compromised by splinters, condenser efficiency can drop rapidly, pushing diesel or auxiliary systems into unsafe margins. A 5–10 degrees Celsius rise in critical spaces over minutes is operationally significant. Repair parties cannot reach valves through flame and smoke without protective gear, and the time spent rigging ad hoc lines reduces ammunition supply to guns. On Sydney, damage control doctrine called for immediate boundary setting, flooding control, and the protection of magazines. Flooding forward increased trim by degrees that mere helm corrections could not mask. A 2-degree bow-down trim at 15 knots drives the bow deeper into oncoming swell, complicating spray formation, wetting forward decks, and reducing the freeboard margin over damaged plates. Counter-flooding to correct list and trim carries trade-offs. Every ton of water admitted to correct heel adds weight and reduces reserve buoyancy. Without intact communications, These calculations depend on compartment-level initiative rather than centralized orders. Short, sharp exchanges continued as Sydney attempted to open the range on an oblique. Whether her aft turrets achieved sustained local control fire is contested. Some reconstructions cite intermittent straddles on Kormoran that set additional fires. Others infer sparse, degrading output as control circuits failed. We were hit, and fires started spreading aft. The situation became untenable if we remained. A Kormoran, officer recalled. Paraphrase. The untenable threshold, in analytic terms, is when the probability of a disabling hit to engines, steering, or mine decks per minute exceeds the probability of escaping if contact breaks. With smoke increasing and dusk approaching, Detmer's optimal move shifted from sustained gunnery to creating conditions for breakaway and scuttle. A practical indicator of that shift is ammunition expenditure. Post-war German logs refer to several hundred 150 mm rounds fired in total. Uncertain, precise count varies by source. A rate which, if sustained at 5 revolutions per minute for 6 guns, implies multiple minutes of high-intensity output before fatigue, heat, and supply interruptions force reductions. Every interruption to feed lines, splintered hoists, blocked passages reduces volume of fire and, with it, the ability to keep the cruiser under continuous shock. Once Sydney's silhouette began to recede behind smoke and dusk, the raiders' chance to disengage improved at the cost of accepting that self-destruction might be required to avoid capture with codes and mine stocks intact. By twilight, the battle had transformed from parallel short-range gunnery to a messy separation under worsening visibility. Sydney, wounded forward and ablaze topside, angled away. Kormoran, herself burning and with engineering risk rising, prepared the logic tree of scuttle versus drift. No survivors from the Australian cruiser would later testify. The sequence is therefore reconstructed from German witness statements, damage analysis of both wrecks, and the operational physics of ships under fire. As daylight faded, short-range attrition gave way to a visibility-driven disengagement. Reduced speed and damaged control on Sydney met rising engineering risk on Kormoran. The raiders' calculus pivoted from exchange to escape and scuttle, while the cruiser's degraded maneuver left her survival probabilities falling with each minute of uncontrolled flooding and fire. Dusk to nightfall, the 19th of November 1941, off Western Australia separation, scuttle, and last sighting. After the heaviest exchange, the ships began to pull apart, not by agreement but by the mechanics of damage and light. Sunset near to 1850 local reduced contrast and flattened silhouettes. Smoke compounded the effect, drifting under a trade wind of roughly 10-15 knots. Witness accounts from Kormoran describe Sydney moving away on a southerly to southeasterly bearing, still burning forward and amidships. The relative range, previously estimated at 1,000–2,000 yards during the opening, widened beyond several thousand yards as darkness took hold. In low light, the probability of hit per round falls measurably, often by tens of %, once aiming reverts to local sights through smoke and glare, making pursuit or decisive finishing fire less likely for either side. Aboard Kormoran, the tactical problem inverted. Fires had taken hold topside and, more dangerously, threatened spaces that supported propulsion, and the mine inventory commonly reported at 300+ mines on the voyage, uncertain, exact count, on 19 November. Engineering survivability hinged on seawater circulation and the ability to keep pumps and condensers within temperature margins. Under splinter damage, even a partial failure of cooling lines can drive machinery temperatures upward by 5–10 degrees Celsius over minutes, pushing plants toward an emergency stop to avoid seizure or explosive failure. Detmer's decision tree narrowed to 2 options: attempt to maintain steerage and hope for a clean break under cover of smoke and dusk, or prepare for scuttling to prevent capture of codes, weapons, and mines. His post-war notes summarize the pivot plainly. With fires increasing and the risk to engines and mines rising, we prepared to abandon and scuttle. Paraphrase. Scuttling a raider was a deliberate, multi-point process. Charges had to be placed or opened at designated flooding points, valves set to admit seawater, and critical documents destroyed. The timescale is operationally important. Trained parties can ready scuttling within tens of minutes, but smoke, heat, and blocked passages lengthen the sequence. German testimony indicates that abandoned ship orders followed assessment that the fires could not be contained without risking detonation or total engineering failure. Boats and rafts were manned in darkness, an evolution complicated by residual ammunition cooking off and the tendency of rafts to drift rapidly once clear. The crew count aboard Kormoran prior to the battle stood near 300 and 8,400 personnel, uncertain, exact complement at action. The number later taken as prisoners of war by Australian authorities would exceed 300, indicating that, despite the fires and night, the majority were able to abandon ship. The last sighting of Sydney, from Kormoran's perspective, is consistently described as a distant, burning silhouette moving on a SSE to SE course, with flickers suggestive of ongoing fires and intermittent flashes. Historiography. Some accounts interpret flashes as explosions, others as flare, ups from fuel and topside materials. Range estimations at night are imprecise. Even so, the separation likely extended into the order of 5–10 nautical miles as hours passed. A ship with forward flooding and impaired command circuits faces a compounding problem. Speed falls dropping from to 18–20 knots toward the low teens or single digits, and control of list, trim, and fire boundaries grows harder with every cut cable or failed pump. In such conditions, even a minor change in sea state, 0.51 meters swell, exacts a penalty in green water forward and spray, further challenging fire teams and electrical continuity. The quantitative frame for the night is stark. Sydney's complement numbered 645 officers and ratings. No survivors were recovered. For Kormoran, later counts of survivors taken into custody reached on the order of 317 commonly cited, a figure that implies abandonment at sea, survival rates above 75% despite night, fire, and the risk of secondary explosions. Drift dynamics then took over. Boats and rafts in a 10–15 knot wind can move 1–2 nautical miles per hour relative to water when pushed by both wind and sea. Over a 10-hour night, that drift could displace survivors by 10–20 nautical miles before daylight, and rescue efforts began to intersect their positions. Some German boats would eventually make landfall on the Western Australian coast in subsequent days, uncertain, individual landing locations and timings, while others were picked up by searching vessels. Operationally, the night denied both ships their doctrinal pathways. A cruiser with director, bridge, and forward structure compromised could not impose standoff gunnery. A raider with rising internal temperatures, damaged topsides, and a sensitive mine load could not risk prolonged exposure or capture. The outcome, Sydney's disappearance after nightfall and Kormoran's abandonment and scuttling, was not the product of a single dramatic event so much as the culmination of earlier choices that compressed range and destroyed redundancy. As one later Australian analysis phrased it, the battle ceased to be tactical and became a test of damage, control margins. By night, one ship crossed that margin, and the other erased itself to deny capture. Commission Commentary 2009, paraphrase. The information asymmetry imposed by the loss of all hands aboard Sydney shapes the record. Timelines for her final hours rely on indirect evidence. German witness bearings and times, wreck, site analysis decades later, and the physics of flooding progression in a forward-damaged Leander-class hull. Progressive structural failure forward, exacerbated by fires and potential secondary hits, is consistent with a ship losing buoyancy and stability over hours rather than minutes. Whether final foundering occurred before midnight or later, uncertain, precise time, remains outside definitive reconstruction. What is clear is that no distress signal acknowledged by authorities was tied to Sydney in the hours after dusk. Historiography. Scattered reports exist, but remain unconfirmed. For Kormoran's crew, the immediate post-scuttle priorities were triage, navigation without instruments, and survival. Rations, water, and basic medical care were rationed by boat. The distances to the coast or to expected shipping lanes were estimated by dead reckoning. The decision to steer for the Western Australian coast by some boats accepting grounding risk over the uncertainty of open sea pickup reflected a pragmatic reading of drift, prevailing wind, and the likelihood of air or surface search patterns. Those choices would intersect with Australian search operations in the following days. Darkness and damage transformed maneuver into survival mathematics. Kormoran's fires and mine risk compelled scuttling. Sydney's forward damage and degraded command made recovery improbable. With no Australian survivors to testify, the night fixed the exchange. A raider lost to self-destruction, a cruiser lost without witnesses. November 2027, 1941. Western Australia search, interrogations, and the information gap. The 20th of November 1941, Fremantle and the mid-Indian Ocean approaches. When HMAS Sydney did not make her expected landfall, routine signal traffic turned into alarm. Naval authorities issued queries and tasked immediate reconnaissance from Western Australian bases. Royal Australian Air Force patrol aircraft Hudsons and Ansons, operating at roughly 140 knots, with 6 10-hours endurance. Uncertain, exact types and sorties, were briefed on a search box west of Shark Bay. The initial sea search drew on what was at hand: local patrol craft, coastal steamers seconded to duty, and available warships diverted from convoy assignments. Within 48 hours, multiple tracks were being crossed in a widening pattern. The geometry grew by the hour because drift at 10-15 knots of wind can move debris in boats 1-2 nautical miles per hour. Over a day, that is to 50 nautical miles of displacement. Over 4 days, the radius of uncertainty can exceed 100 nautical miles. The first hard data did not come from Sydney, but from the enemy. German boats and rafts from HSK Kormoran abandoned after scuttling once fires threatened machinery and mine decks began to be sighted or to make landfall. One group reached the Western Australian coast near Carnarvon after days at sea, uncertain precise landing point and date, while others were intercepted by searching vessels. By late November, Australian authorities had in custody on the order of 300-plus German survivors, commonly cited later as to 317. Their statements were the earliest consistent narrative: an engagement with a cruiser on the afternoon of 19 November, short-range gunfire, a torpedo hit on the cruiser, the raider set a fire, and eventual scuttling to avoid capture. "We fought at close range. We had to scuttle," a Kormoran officer summarized under interrogation. Paraphrase: Australian Naval Intelligence Notes, 1941. Interrogations began as soon as boats were secured. The process was standard: segregate officers from ratings, cross-check names and watch bills, map claimed positions, and press for technical details. Analysts sought measurable specifics: ranges, bearings, salvo counts, torpedo settings. Some of the earliest interrogations recorded statements that placed the opening range at short, perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 yards, and the torpedo run immediate, paraphrase, aligning with the battle geometry hypothesized by Australian staff, based on doctrine and the known risks of raiders. Detmers, Kormoran's captain, confirmed the deception profile and the necessity of sudden unmasking when pressed. "Once exposed, we fought." Paraphrase, POW W debrief, 1941-42. These accounts, however, did not solve the operational mystery nearest to Fremantle. the location and condition of Sydney and her 645 personnel. The search area expanded and shifted southward and westward as currents and wind were modeled. In practical terms, air and sea units tried to cover tens of thousands of square miles, uncertain, exact total, a task constrained by endurance, aircraft cycles measured in hours, daylight, approximately 13-14 hours usable at that latitude in late November, and the competing demands of convoy protection along the coast. Surface search speeds of 12-18 knots and aircraft ground speeds of to 120 knots impose a cadence on grid sweeps. A single Hudson scanning a 10-15 nautical mile swath can cover a few hundred square miles per sortie, but effectiveness falls with sea state and whitecap coverage. The first confirmed debris from Sydney, if any, was conclusively logged that week, did not immediately fix a wreck position. We have prisoners from the raider. No contact with Sydney, an Australian staff summary noted, paraphrase, late November 1941. Public information lagged behind classified signals. Wartime censorship procedures required that loss announcements wait on internal confirmation and the management of operational risk. Families and the public therefore encountered a controlled sequence. Initial silence, then reports of the enemy raiders' survivors, and only later the formal acknowledgement of the cruiser's loss. The interval mattered in morale terms but had no effect on the mechanics at sea. Search crews still faced a diminishing probability problem. After 72 hours, survival odds in open boats with minimal water declined steeply. After a week, even exceptional cases become unlikely without landfall. For Sydney's company, there were no survivors to be recovered. Material collected from the German prisoners helped refine a map of the action. Interrogators drew course lines and range rings on charts. The claimed bearing of separation SSE to SE for the burning cruiser pushed the likely sinking ground into a band west of Western Australia that, decades later, would align with the wreck discoveries. Analysts also seized on ammunition expenditure claims as indirect metrics. If Kormoran fired several hundred 150 mm rounds, uncertain, precise count varies by source, then the time under continuous close-range fire must have been measured in minutes, sufficient to disable a cruiser's director and bridge. The cross-consistency of independent German accounts on opening range and torpedo use increased analytic confidence. Still, a central unknown remained. Why had Sydney approached so close? Theories at the time included misidentification of house flags, confidence in peacetime recognition lists, and the urge to verify identity at short range for boarding, a procedure suitable for a docile merchantman, but dangerous before masks dropped. The approach compressed the range. At that range, a raider can trade itself for a cruiser, one Australian officer summarized in a confidential note, paraphrase, 1942. Search operations wound down by stages, not by declaration. Each negative sweep subtracted probability mass from the hope of finding survivors. Each additional German group rescued confirmed the raiders' scuttling and the rough time mark of the action. The operational ledger, by the end of the month, showed asymmetry. 645 Australians lost, roughly 300 Germans captured alive, one auxiliary cruiser destroyed by her captain's order, and a Leander-class cruiser missing without a distress signal, acknowledged in time to intervene. In the absence of the Australian ship's company, the narrative that would circulate in staff colleges and later inquiries distilled to doctrine and geometry. Raider deception exploited identification protocol. Range collapsed. First-salvo plus torpedo set the terms of the exchange. The week after the battle confirmed outcomes without closing causes. Interrogations and drift math established close-range combat and scuttling. Exhaustive searches produced prisoners, not survivors. In the analytic vacuum left by Sydney's silence, protocol and approach distance emerged as the central variables. 1941, 1942, Canberra and Admiralty Doctrine rewrites, range, readiness, and air spotting. The disappearance of HMAS Sydney in November 1941 moved quickly from tragedy to doctrine. Within weeks, Australian and British naval staffs circulated provisional guidance aimed at the specific mechanics of the engagement: deceptive identity at sea, compressed range, first-salvo suppression, and a short torpedo run. The resulting amendments did not attempt to outlaw uncertainty. Commerce lanes would always present ambiguous silhouettes, but they did convert analysis into numbers. Minimum approach distances were restated in cables and orders as bands, not suggestions. Challenge and verify at standoff. Only reduce range when weapon readiness, angle off, and an exit geometry are assured. In practical terms, this meant holding at 5,000 to 8,000 yards, 2.54 nautical miles, until call signs, house flags, and routing papers aligned, rather than closing to 1,000 to 2,000 yards where a raider's 150 mm battery and torpedoes could decide the exchange in seconds. The quantitative spine of the new guidance was straightforward. A cruiser's 6-inch battery, under director control, maintains practical accuracy at 8,000 yards. A raider's hidden guns are also dangerous at that range, but a superstructure hit on a warship is less decisive than the inverse case at 1,500 yards. Torpedo arithmetic reinforced the same point. At 40 knots, a 533 mm weapon needs to 90 seconds to cover 2,000 yards and 180 seconds for 4,000 yards. Time enough for a warship at 225-30 knots to comb the tracks by a 20-30 degrees turn, whereas at 1,000 yards the run is under a minute and the decision window collapses. Staff summaries phrased it in technical but unambiguous language. Standoff distance increases the number of decision cycles available before torpedo effect. Paraphrase: Admiralty Memorandum, early 1942. Readiness states were likewise rewritten in light of raider encounters. Instead of approaching a solitary merchantman with turrets fore and aft trained for, safeties in, and secondary armament manned but not fully cleared, orders stressed arm and train before the final challenge. That entailed director crews closed up, turret crews at immediate notice, and torpedo lookouts doubled, particularly when sea states and sun angle favored a disguised opponent's gun shutters. One Australian note distilled the logic in a single line: identity cannot be confirmed at a range where first fire cannot be met by instant return. Paraphrase: Ranfleet Order, 1942. The change cost fuel and tempo warships slowed or held station outside the old comfort distances, but it converted seconds into minutes, and minutes are survival. Aviation policy absorbed the lesson as well. Cruiser-borne aircraft Walrus, or equivalent, were to be launched when practicable, before a close inspection, not after a merchant hull filled the binoculars. An airborne observer at 110 knots with a 10-15 nautical mile loiter ring could confirm call signs, house flags, and even deck cargo anomalies without sacrificing the ship's standoff. Training syllabi reflected the pivot. Identification drills expanded from recognition slides to timed flag lamp exchanges with non-cooperative responses. Aircraft sections added modules for shadowing and photographic confirmation. The metrics bled into planning. If an aircraft needs to 7-10 minutes from crew alert to catapult launch in benign conditions, commanders were now expected to add that buffer before committing to the close phase of a challenge. The raider problem also returned to scale. In 1940-41, the Kriegsmarine operated a small but active roster of Hilfskreuzer across the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans, uncertain, exact count in commission at any month. Their aggregate sinkings ran into hundreds of thousands of tons of merchant shipping. Historiography, tonnage totals vary by compilation. Against that backdrop, Sydney's loss looked less like an outlier and more like a tail risk event inside a known threat model. Staff papers emphasized category awareness. Any single unescorted merchantman, in a poorly patrolled lane could be a raider. Therefore, the default posture must assume capability until proven otherwise. A British staff officer writing without reference to the Australian case put it plainly, "To a raider, the ideal distance is that at which a torpedo will surely bite before we can act." Paraphrase, Signals discipline received particular scrutiny. Reports from multiple theaters had already flagged mishoists, delayed replies, and partial call signs as frequent artifacts of stress or damage aboard legitimate merchantmen. The rewritten guidance therefore distinguished noise from red lines. Red lines included an asserted identity inconsistent with routing or current notices, refusal to stop engines when ordered, and any movement to bring a purported freighter's beam on while delaying full identification, each a maneuver that increased torpedo probability. Quantitatively, orders suggested breaking off or widening at the first red line behavior, not the second or third. This conservative bias reflected the asymmetry of consequences. A false positive, treating a genuine merchantman as suspect, cost time and fuel. A false negative, accepting a raider as genuine at short range, could cost a warship. Training establishments converted these abstractions into exercises. Gunnery schools ran mask drop drills, where a merchantman target abruptly opened simulated gun ports. Bridge teams practiced emergency turns. Blue 15, Blue 30. On torpedo sightings, with measured rudder orders, 20 degrees within 5-10 seconds, to comb tracks at 25 knots. Signal schools imposed lamp delays and flag errors during challenge sequences, forcing watch officers to decide whether to hold standoff or close. The scoring rubric tracked 3 measurable outcomes: time held outside 4,000 yards before identity, time from torpedo sighting call to effective turn, and readiness state of main armament at the moment a mask drop occurred. Units that consistently reached local drill targets, for example, is less than 8 seconds to rudder over. Turrets trained and loaded before the last challenge. Aircraft airborne by the second exchange were rated as match fit for raider contacts. The RAN's internal narrative also adjusted tone. Instead of treating the Indian Ocean and Western Australian approaches as a peripheral theater, planners elevated the lane's risk profile. Air patrol density was increased where resources allowed, and convoy practices zigzag patterns. Screen dispositions were re-examined for coastwise routes. None of these changes guaranteed immunity. They did, however, tighten the chain from suspicion to action. The phrase, "range is advantage," used informally in staff rooms, became a de facto caption for a year's worth of memos. There was, inevitably, debate. Some officers argued that excessive caution would slow trade and overburden escorts. Others warned that raiders, recognizing their declining margins at standoff, would adapt with bolder plays or decoys. Historiography. View A stressed aggressive boarding at moderate range with covering fire. View B insisted on strict standoff until identity. The compromise in most theaters favored standoff plus air. As a post-war summary, observed of these 1,942 adjustments, the safest test of identity is conducted from outside torpedo range, with guns ready and eyes above the horizon line. Paraphrase, Admiralty Historical Note, late 1,940 seconds. In 1942, staff work converted the physics of the Sydney Kormoran fight into rules. Hold range, keep weapons and maneuver ready, and raise eyes with air. The reforms did not remove uncertainty, but they stretched decision time from seconds to minutes enough to preserve a cruiser's intrinsic advantages against a disguised freighter. 2001, 2015. West Australian Shelf and Archives Rex, Forensics, and The Final Ledger. March 2008, west of Steep Point, Western Australia. After years of archival work and seabed search proposals, An expedition sponsored by the Finding Sydney Foundation located the wreck of HSK Kormoran on the continental slope at a depth on the order of 2,600 meters. Within days, HMAS Sydney, 2, was also found likewise in deep water, separated from the raider by roughly 10-12 nautical miles. The sonar mosaics and ROV imagery converted testimony into geometry. Sydney lay with massive forward damage and extensive topside collapse. Kormoran showed the signatures of fire and scuttle. The seabed gave back the battle's numbers. Positions, headings at rest, and debris scatters measurable in meters rather than guessed across miles. The forensic questions sharpened. Investigators mapped blast patterns, hull ruptures, and the distribution of plating. Sydney's forward damage, long debated in print, aligned with the hypothesis of a bow-port torpedo strike, with consequent flooding and progressive structural failure forward. The ship's state at rest, bow damage, superstructure devastation, and separated features was consistent with cumulative fire and flooding rather than a single magazine detonation as the sole explanatory event. Historiography. View A proposed a catastrophic explosion. View B emphasized progressive damage post-2008 analyses favored the latter. Kormoran's imagery, in turn, documented heavy topside burn and a hull consistent with controlled abandonment and scuttling charges. The wrecks tell a coherent story of close-range action and mutual destruction. One expedition summary concluded, paraphrase, 2008. Depths and distances added further quantification. Sydney rested in roughly to 2,400, 2,500 meters of water. Kormoran into 2,500, 2,600 meters. Uncertain. Exact soundings vary by sensor and datum. Their separation of 11-12 nautical miles matched German accounts that the ships drew apart at dusk before the raider was abandoned and scuttled. The vector from the engagement locus to the final positions plotted within the drift envelopes that 1,941 searchers had sketched, but technology, in 2008, reduced uncertainty radii from hundreds of square miles to GPS-grade fixes. We always believed the evidence could be reconciled on the seabed. Expedition leader David Mearns noted in a post-mission debrief, paraphrase, 2008-09. The Commonwealth's 2009 Commission of Inquiry integrated the wreck data with archival signals, POW interrogations, and naval doctrine. Its findings formalized what operational analysis had long implied. Sydney closed to very short range. Kormoran unmasked and opened fire with 150 mm guns and torpedoes. Early hits disabled Sydney's director and bridge. A torpedo strike forward sealed the cruiser's disadvantage, and both ships suffered escalating damage that forced separation and, for the raider, scuttle. The Commission also underlined the doctrinal lesson. Identification at ranges within certain torpedo envelopes presents unacceptable risk. Paraphrase, 2009. Where the inquiry entertained alternative scenarios, boarding intent, accidental proximity, or misread signals, it invariably returned to the same axis of causation. Distance lost, decision time evaporated. The human ledger, never abstract to those on Australia's western coast, found a physical grammar in memorial and number. Sydney's complement 645 remained absolute. German survivors landed or rescued on the order of 317 entered camps as POWs until war's end. At Geraldton, the HMAS Sydney II Memorial, whose components were dedicated in stages around the turn of the millennium, incorporated the Dome of Souls, 645 stainless steel gulls, one for each sailor arranged in a lattice that reads as both flight and roll call. Quantities here do what they have done throughout this documentary: translate loss and survival into integers that resist embellishment. Post-2008 scholarship used the wrecks to test specific claims. Could a cruiser of Sydney's class have recovered once both director and bridge were suppressed at to 1,000–2,000 yards? The gunnery math shell time of flight hit fractions at close range through smoke. The torpedo's arrival in under a minute argued no. Did Kormoran's damage picture fit sustained 6-inch return fire at short range? Burn patterns, collapsed structures, and the documented scuttle sequence argued yes. Were there traces that forced a revision to survivor testimony? Minor details shifted under the camera, but the battle's outline held. Physical evidence corroborates the essentials of multiple independent accounts. The commission staff summarized, paraphrase, 2009. The final analytics reach beyond one latitude and date. Raiders, whether disguised auxiliary cruisers in 1941 or any modern analog of deceptive contacts at sea, convert ambiguity into weapon effects by compressing range and timing. Sydney's loss codified a tactic that other navies already suspected. In the torpedo era, challenge distance is not etiquette, it is armor. The reforms traced in 1942 standoff verification at 5/8 QYD, weapons and helm at the ready, and airborne spotting before close read today as standard prudence, but they were paid for in November 1941. As a British historical note later put it, the safest test of identity is made from beyond the reach of the first blow. Paraphrase, late 1940 seconds. For Australia, the wreck discoveries closed a cartographic question and eased a generational ache, but they did not change the exchange rate written into the action. One raider, scuttled by her master to avoid capture. One modern light cruiser, lost with all hands. The numbers are unequal in lives, yet symmetrical in operational implication. Kormoran achieved the only trade a raider can hope for. Sydney's approach at close range surrendered the advantages a cruiser is built to exploit. The seabed confirms what doctrine now guards against. Identification that erases distance risks, erasing a ship. Deep ocean forensics resolved the last ambiguities without altering the logic. Short-range identification enabled a disguised raider to trade itself for a cruiser. The wrecks, their depths, and their separation transposed testimony into measured fact and reinforced doctrine now designed to prevent repetition.